Hey everybody, Jeff Witt is one of the smartest guys in terms of free-to-play monetization I've ever met. I've learned so much from Jeff about free-to-play monetization. Jeff was one of the founders of Funzio. He was one of the lead game designers on Modern War. He designed World Domination, which, quadrupled the monetization of that game. And he's just a really, really smart guy. And in today's conversation with Jeff, we talk about a lot of very interesting topics with respect to free-to-play monetization, including an overview in terms of the key types of monetization, ad monetization, what are the most successful types of free-to-play monetization, the latest monetization trends, the success of Battle Pass and challenges with implementing Battle Pass in free-to-play game designs, the evolution of Gacha, some of the biggest free-to-play monetization mistakes you can make, sales and events, and basically the future of free-to-play monetization. So it's a really, really good discussion. I think it's absolutely going to be worth your time. This was one of the earliest videos that I shot, so the audio quality is actually not so great, but I hope you bear with me through the audio problems because the conversation with Jeff is really, really fantastic. And with that, I take you to Jeff Witt talking about free-to-play monetization right now. Hey everybody, I am here today with Jeff Witt, and today we are going to be talking about free-to-play monetization. And just starting with the first question, Jeff, can you talk to us about like the high-level categories of like free-to-play monetization?
Yeah, so there's a couple different things. Obviously, there's Gacha, which has been around in the free-to-play industry almost since day one. Just the random chance of getting something prolongs how much players have to, or increases how much players have to pay to get what they want. So it's a pretty staple thing. More recently, you have more direct sales and bundles and packs, which increases the perceived value of what players are spending for. On the activity side, you have energy, so games that try to monetize more on players doing stuff. Energy is a good source. You have on the cosmetic side, like vanity items, reskins. Those are usually those can be sold in Gacha or bundles, or just a direct sale in the store for currency. Subscriptions, I think, have become bigger in the last few years. Paying once on a weekly or monthly cadence to get stuff every day, or in its more recent iteration, the Battle Pass from Fortnite, which is technically a subscription, but not so much for receiving stuff, but more for unlocking content. So a lot of things for games to work with. City building for city building games, having the initial cost of starting a construction and then paying to speed it up. That's also a staple in a lot of game genres. So there's a lot of things for games to use to monetize.
And one of the other areas we were talking about a little bit is for a lot of casual or hyper-casual games in terms of ad monetization. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts on ad monetization?
Yeah, I like ad monetization because for the players who don't spend, it's a way for a game to make some money from them. The trick, though, is you need to be able to have the ad provide clear value for the player, but not undermine your other sources of monetization. So how you implement ads and what you reward is really important. Some ways you can do that are one-time or two-time ads where you get maybe 10 hard currency. A lot of players will get it if hard currency is hard to come by, and they'll watch the ad or the two ads, but you could factor in the 20 hard currency per day that players will get from that in your economy and make sure it's not undermining other things. But players will still watch it because they're getting 50 cents worth of hard currency just for watching a 30-second ad. But the key to making that successful is you have to limit the amount of times they could do it, and it still has to be something of value. 10 hard currency versus 1 hard currency, which may not seem worth it to players. So I'm a big believer in ads. You just have to really think about the design of how they watch the ad and how much value they're getting from it.
Got it. And in terms of some of the specific categories or types of free-to-play monetization that you talked about, what do you think are the most prevalent or the most successful in terms of how much they're generating in terms of revenue?
That's hard. So like, I feel with bundles and packs, it kind of requires a gacha system, an energy system to really like be valuable. So if I'm playing a game and like gacha is the main source of getting characters getting more powerful, but I'm as a spender really do not like the RNG component, having a bundle come along and say, hey, here's this character for $4.99 or $9.99 or however much you're charging, suddenly that looks like such a great value because of how random gacha is. But that bundle may not be as valuable if gacha was not there in the first place. Like, you kind of have to players have to kind of be frustrated by gacha in order to make the sale or the bundle more enticing. Similarly with like energy, for example, like energy could be a great monetizer on games that have players do a lot of actions, but spending for hard currency on energy may be a negative experience, doing it over and over again. But if that is a negative experience for players, then here comes a bundle with 300 energy instead of 50 for hard currency. Again, looks like a greater deal, but the bundle would not look like a great deal if it wasn't for high cost of buying energy. So a lot of these systems, you have to kind of work together to make the bundle more enticing. With gacha, though, with different types of sale gacha, it's the same thing, right? Like box gacha, which is a variant of gacha, only works as well as it does because of how frustrating normal gacha is. If you don't know what box gacha is, it's a gacha with a finite amount of cards that you kind of know what they are beforehand, and every time you buy it, you get something from that. So eventually, as a spender, if you spend enough, you will get the card that you want. There's a definite high price to it with some randomness, but you're not going to keep spending and not get what you want, which is the risk with regular gacha. Like box gacha would not be as successful if there was no regular gacha to sort of anchor players' expectations. So a lot of these monetization systems have to work well together in order for a studio to leverage them and develop enticing sales.
What about the latest trends? What are you seeing in terms of what's becoming more popular or what's kind of changing in terms of free-to-play monetization?
So, I've been in this industry for 10 years now, and it has been a lot more friendly to free players and lighter spenders. When I first started, there's a clear, hard pay gate that if you weren't a spender, you just couldn't do stuff. Now we see that free players and lighter spenders can pretty much do almost everything that heavy spenders can, but there's still an advantage to spending. So like gacha, like it used to be, if you didn't buy gacha for hard currency, then you weren't getting that. But you take a game like Clash Royale, and suddenly you're getting gachas for just playing. You have to wait to open them, but it's still a lot more friendly to the free player than it could have been. Same with a lot of more modern RPGs. You know exactly how to grind for things, and you can just spend your energy and go for the upgrades that you want. But if you spend money, you're going to be able to get a lot more stuff. And with progressive pricing that we see, like even a lot of like the energy purchases, for example, in these RPGs, the first energy purchase is pretty cheap, but then subsequent ones get more and more expensive. So even like free players who earn some hard currency each day, they're trained to start spending hard currency because of the artificially low prices. But then, as progressive pricing increases the cost of these things, their progression stops for the day, and they have to wait till the next day when all the progressive costs reset, or they have to spend and make more progress that day. And on that note, I think that's why subscriptions have become bigger in the last year or two, because it is a way for a player who's afraid of spending to spend once and know they're getting these, going to get these benefits, this more progression for a week or a month, however long the subscription lasts. That is less or more, that is more appealing to someone who's afraid of spending than taking a random chance buying a gacha or whatnot. So it's a great time to be a player of a free-to-play game if you're not willing to spend as much. But at the same time, when you get really into a game, don't be surprised if you are pushed to spend with end game, live ops events, and other things.
And talking about one of the more popular trends in terms of Battle Pass, which you mentioned, sort of Fortnite came on and it seemed to be a very successful model. Can you talk about why do you think Battle Pass has been able to be so successful?
Yeah, I was really impressed with Battle Pass. For Fortnite, the Battle Royale sort of combat system, it became a hit with players, but by itself, there really is no direction for players. Like, they're not told how often they should be playing, how well they should be doing in those matches, of the cosmetics, like what they should be striving to get. And to me, Battle Pass just answers 90% of the questions players have. Players see that, they pay once for 10 weeks and they get access to all these challenges that later direct their playing experience. So to me, Battle Pass is more of an engagement retention feature than monetization. It happens to monetize as well, which is great, but as any studio knows, like, retention and engagement are also critical to monetization because it keeps players in the game long enough to monetize on other things. And in the case of Fortnite, that is, cosmetic items and future battle passes. I think it works really well for them. And I think for games where a studio is trying to struggle with the motivation for players playing their gameplay, it is something to definitely consider and see if it works for that studio.
And we're now seeing a lot of companies trying to emulate or copy Battle Pass and stick Battle Pass and other types of gameplay. And so far, it seems like they have not been super successful. Can you talk about, so what are the challenges of implementing a Battle Pass system? Why isn't it not working for some other types of games?
So, with any viral hit, there is the danger that their priorities are not going to be your priorities. When you have a game that has millions of DAU that are active, that are engaged, and are spending a fair amount, your number one concern is retention and engagement, right? You're already making a good amount of money. Yes, you could squeeze in more for sure, but that's not your primary concern. My worry is that studios with games with a much smaller DAU will do the Battle Pass and will only offer cosmetic goods. Just because Fortnite can get away with only offering cosmetic goods does not mean a game of a couple 100,000 DAU or smaller will be able to do that and have a sustainable monetization. Especially if your game relies on stats at any point, you may need to offer stats as part of your rewards for the Battle Pass. it still won't break the dynamic, I feel like, because one of the beauties of Battle Pass is that if a player's engaged enough, they could probably get to the end if they just play the game long enough, which is still leaps ahead of other free-to-play games where to win an event, you usually have to spend. So I do feel that there is room for stats as rewards as part of the Battle Pass. And games that have a stat component and a much smaller DAU, you may need to consider that to help drive players versus Fortnite's implementation of it, which Fortnite, there's not really a stat component in the game, so they just offer pure vanity items. And similarly with the challenges, like Fortnite is very creative with what they challenge players to do. It's not just about their core gameplay, but you have to use specific characters or use specific weapons or do seemingly arbitrary things. And the importance of that is that it keeps the challenges varied, it keeps the game from getting too monotonous, and to a certain extent it extends your content. A lot, like if you're say you're doing another shooter, you will want challenges to require use of specific weapons. Otherwise, you risk having players just use one or two weapons and not monetize on the rest. And those are perfectly valid challenges. Like we've seen Fortnite, use the same thing. But it works for them and it works for you in the sense that you're getting players to do stuff in the game that they wouldn't do normally. So if you're going to do Battle Pass, you have to really think about what you want to accomplish with it, and how you want to use it to motivate players. And if you just blindly copy both Fortnite's structure and what they're rewarding, you're probably going to miss the mark when you implement it.
And let's go back to Gacha. Like, Gacha still makes up, a massive amount of monetization free to play. How has that been evolving over time, and what are sort of the latest innovations in terms of Gacha? I mean, you mentioned box Gacha, but is there anything else kind of happening in Gacha?
Yeah. So there's you're starting to see Gacha with not just character shards in RPG, for example, but you're seeing other stuff in it that players can get. You're starting to see Gacha being used more as an item where it's still there, players are still opening it, but you could see a bundle that gives you 5 Gacha plus all this other stuff. So a little more itemized version of it. You see Gacha with progressive pricing. So the first, the first Gacha box is low price, and the price gets higher. And then you have Gacha that scales with the player, and this is really important. I think that has only recently been addressed. Gacha has always been great for the early to mid game, especially in like an RPG where players fill the best in slots with stuff they get from Gacha, and no matter what you get, it's usually best in slot. One of the biggest weaknesses of Gacha is when you hit the Elder game, it's hard not to get anything from Gacha that's not fodder. And that's not a good experience when you get something and you're just going to feed it into another hero. I've seen 2 games that kind of try to scale the value of Gacha with where players are at. Again, Clash Royale is a good example. When you hit a new arena tier, the Gacha gives more cards out, and there's more different stuff in the Gacha. So even though you're technically getting a similar quality chest, that chest is just better than what it was when you first started playing. And then Heroes Charge is another example where the Gacha you're getting is not scaling, but there's a valuable use for what you're getting throughout the lifetime of the game.
What do you mean by that? The Gacha isn't scaling.
So Heroes Charge, like the contents of the Hero Scroll, or not Heroes Charge, sorry, Idle Heroes. The content of what you get on the Hero Scroll doesn't change from when you're level 1 to when you're level 40, at least as far as I can tell. But even if it's a hero, even if you're getting a hero that you're not using, you will need to use that hero to upgrade the heroes that you are using to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stars. So effectively, every time you use a hero scroll in Idle Heroes, you will need to keep what you get, because you'll need to use it later to upgrade the stars of the heroes that you like,
Right.
which maintains its value through the lifetime of the game. I think more games that use Gacha, they will need to use some sort of interesting stuff like that to maintain the value. Otherwise, monetization on Gacha will just plummet once a player progresses past the middle of the game.
Let's talk about mistakes. Like, as a free-to-play game designer, designing, sort of monetization for different kinds of games, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you're seeing that people make?
So free-to-play games operate under the same sort of economic rules as everything else does in life. So if a feature works or monetizes in a game, there's some incentive reason why it's doing so. Players are incentivized to engage in that feature, and oftentimes I do feel like developers aren't asking themselves, why is this feature working in this game, and how would that same thing work in our game? Like, do we have the same incentives? Are players motivated by the same things in our game as that game that has this feature that is seemingly making lots of money? And in some cases, yes, they would. But a lot of times, they either don't work the same, or they kind of work, but not all the elements are there. I'll give an example. So, back at my time in Funzio, we did a guild versus guild event that did really well. And a lot of people looked at that and said, well, the only reason it's doing well is like the social pressure of guild versus guild, which is definitely a big component, but it wasn't the only component. Like, our RPGs, if you think of our units as a card, like our deck size was 3,000. And each guild versus guild war, we were giving the top players like 50 of the best units in the game, which is super valuable. But because our deck size is 3,000, we could absorb a lot of that inflation. If a 5 deck size party tried to implement one-to-one that feature, it would fail utterly, because you cannot reward stuff as valuable, thereby not motivating players as much, or if you did, the content would quickly run out, and your economy would kind of be in shambles. So, like, yes, a studio would look at that feature and say they believe that they've cracked it, but unless you also had a deep deck size, and unless your rewards could be equally valuable, it would not be as successful as it was in our games. And I think that applies for any feature that a developer is thinking about adopting. If you're not getting all the elements that makes that work, it's not going to work the same for you. If doesn't mean you shouldn't adopt it, but you may need to tweak it so that it fits with what you're trying to do.
Got it. So it kind of sounds like one of the big mistakes is just understanding the specific context for your game, and then to some degrees, some laziness on the part of designers, where it's just like, okay, I'm just going to cut and paste this model into our game.
Yes, you really need to kind of understand what is working for your game right now, and whether player behavior is going to fit with what you're trying to adopt, and if not, then change stuff. Like, I feel developers are afraid to also change stuff that works in other games. An example is for idle games is Prestige or Ascension, whatever we call it. Like, the earliest variants of the idle games prestiging was just so arbitrary. Like, there was no rhyme or reason when to do it. Like, you could tell that when you were slow enough that it was about time, but the game wasn't really telling you, and starting over seemed pointless. Like, you weren't really, except for getting more efficient, you weren't improving, or you felt like you weren't accomplishing much. I think a good designer or developer could make prestiging more meaningful, either story-wise or a sense of achieving something. And a lot of them don't, mainly because no one else has done it, so why should they? But just because someone, like there's a game out there that succeeds doesn't mean that they're doing everything right. And going back to Supercell, for example, I know Supercell has the perception that they're doing everything right, but when Clash Royale was in soft launch, I remember that there was a time when they still had a small gold cost for initiating a match, which made sense in Clash of Clans when you had passive income from buildings. But in Clash Royale, when you have no base and no passive income, it made absolutely no sense to have a small gold cost to initiate a match. And they quickly realized that was a mistake and removed it. But it was an example of them just taking it from Clash of Clans because it worked there. So, it's definitely, you should take a lot of inspiration from other designs and feel free to port it over, but just make sure that it works for your game. And if something about the feature doesn't work, change it so that it fits in your game.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about sales and events as well. I know sales and events is a big part of like live ops and monetization longer term in a game. You've been a big proponent of bundle sales, for example, but what are other things that free-to-play designers and product managers should be thinking about with respect to different mechanics or different things with respect to sales and events?
So, events are good way to one of the best ways to monetize from events, I guess, is twofold. One is the event itself, and we've talked about how things have changed since the beginning.
Yeah.
One of the changes that has happened, I think, is for the worst for monetization, has been that a lot of developers are no longer trying to monetize on the event itself, meaning no inputs for actions and stuff like that. And I feel like that's how a lot of games monetized half a decade ago. And you still see some games monetize like that now, just not as many. Like in the RPG space, Legendary, they do a really good job at monetizing on the event itself. Golf Clash is another example with their tournaments. But a lot of games, it's more about stat checks and qualities of your characters, at least for RPGs, and not so much about number of actions or different inputs in order to do an event. So monetizing on the event itself is one way events monetize. The other is sales associated with the event. So in RPGs, it's obviously the heroes that will do X times better in the event. Special event gacha, special event bundles. So events are great because not only gives you a chance to monetize on the event itself, but you're also able to just run sales that connect the player with the event. I like, we talked about Battle Pass in Fortnite, and another thing that goes along with Battle Pass is this idea of seasons, which I think is a very exciting concept that probably more games should explore. The idea that whatever's going on now, it's only going on for this amount of time, and then it's an interesting concept because in a certain way it's like a soft reset every 10 weeks or 3 months. And we already see PvP doing that in a lot of games. You'll have PvP seasons. both in free-to-play and out of free-to-play. But to like structure your content around each season means that with each new season of content, you could bring with it new forms of monetization or new sales or new organize your content a little differently. And that's what makes for great sales. Like the hardest thing to monetizing a game is player expectation of value about what something is worth, and if a game is going to successfully monetize, they have to try and prevent players from forming expectations about what something is worth or how often something will be for sale or available. And I think a concept of a season helps violate expectation, or helps prevent players from having expectations, because each season is different. But with other games, like if you're gonna have sales, make sure that they're not predictable. Don't have the same sale every Friday. That's what that means, is that players will anticipate it, and if they're deciding when to spend, they may just hold out on spending until Friday, versus if they don't know when they're going to see the sale again, they don't know if they could afford to not spend right now versus the next time whenever that sale is going to come up. So yeah, I think the biggest thing with sales, with Gacha, with events, is just not letting players settle expectations for those things, so that they will be more willing to spend, or their incentives for spend won't be undermined by their expectation of what's coming up, what do I need, things like that. I guess that would be my answer to that question.
Great. And last question. So just generally, are there any other thoughts in terms of the future of free-to-play monetization?
I think definitely Battle Pass / subscription is going to be more important. I feel like you're going to create a whole tier of spenders that are just subscription, just Battle Pass, which is great, because if you can get that percent high enough, that I think it would be great for all developers. And if it keeps them in the game long enough to try and monetize them through Elder Game live ops, even better. And to do that, I do think, while our industry has done a great job of making games more suitable to free players or lighter spenders, I think there's still more work to do on that front. The second thing that I think is necessary in the future is to always maintain value of your monetization for Elder Game players. I think all too often, when you get to the Elder Game, things just get way too expensive, and by keeping costs down but just having more content, games will be able to monetize their heavy spenders, their medium spenders, and their lighter spenders for the whole lifetime of the game, versus shutting some of those spender groups out. So it'll be, I think the next few years will be a good time to be a free player and light spender, but also if games are doing things right, if you're a heavy spender, you'll still be seeing a lot of value for your spend.
Great. Well, there you have it. Here with Jeff Witt on free-to-play monetization. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your time.
My pleasure.